Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Fred. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And from now on, I think I will insist that everybody call me Dr. Bawer. I'm about to tell you pretty much what Mark just told you, only at much greater length. I'm here to talk about a subject that a few years ago was not even on my radar. And I certainly never imagined that I would write a couple of books about. When I moved from New York to Europe in 1998, my plan was actually to write a book celebrating Amsterdam and the Netherlands. I had first visited the country a year earlier and had returned several times since. I was enchanted by it, and I really had the impression that the Dutch had come closer than anyone else to attaining the complete secular, liberal democracy that my own country's founding fathers had envisioned. I had never seriously thought of moving abroad, but I did. And within a few weeks of that move, I discovered that there was trouble in paradise. That indeed there was trouble throughout most of Western Europe. For when you strayed just slightly off of the tourist path, you found yourself in a different world. Now, I'm from New York City, so I know what a North American immigrant neighborhood looks like. My father grew up in one. Immigration made North America what it is. Out of the immigrant neighborhoods of New York came the men and women who created Hollywood, who wrote the Great American Songbook, and who made extraordinary contributions to modern science, technology, and much else. That's not what I'm talking about here. No, what I saw in Amsterdam, and would later see in one European city after another, were not temporary immigrant neighborhoods from which young people would move on to become well-integrated members of mainstream society, and some of whom would make extraordinary contributions to tomorrow's Europe. What I saw were steadily growing enclaves in which Muslim families had lived for 2 or 3 generations, where living on the dole had become a family tradition, where young people born in Europe to parents who had been born in Europe could barely speak the language of the country they had been born in, and where everybody, to a remarkable extent, was subject to 7th century Islamic law. Paradoxically, people who had come to Europe as refugees vacationed frequently in the countries they had supposedly fled. Many of them even maintained homes in their countries of origin. They had come to Europe as peasants, but now, thanks to the generosity of European welfare states and the radically different costs of living between Europe and the Muslim world, they were rich back in their home villages, employing servants and in some cases even owning slaves that had been purchased with European taxpayers' money. In these communities, you could find families who were collecting every possible form of welfare largesse available in their adopted country, including child support for children who did not exist and disability benefits for people who were as healthy as a horse. You could find men who had 1 wife in Europe and 2 or 3 more back in the old country. And you could find parents whose children were nowhere to be found because even though they were citizens of a European country, they were in fact attending madrasas thousands of miles away, where they learned about nothing but the Quran and Sharia law, certainly nothing about individual liberty, sexual equality, secular government, or critical thinking, except perhaps that all these things were utterly contrary to the will of Allah. And you could find girls barely into their teens who had been married back in the old country to an illiterate first cousin of theirs who, under family reunification laws, had been able to move to Europe and would eventually secure that most precious of possessions, a Western passport. But the most important thing that you could find in these communities was a widespread rejection of Western freedoms. With few exceptions, these communities were under the thumb of mullahs and imams and family patriarchs who despised European values, which, after all, not only were radically un-Quranic, but also directly threatened those men's power. They despised European women who lived their own lives, who pursued careers of their own choosing, and who dressed as they pleased. They found outrageous the idea of gay people being allowed to live their lives undisturbed. European authorities had given these people an assortment of generous benefits that went far beyond anything in human history, but they hadn't realized that the greatest thing they had to offer immigrants was freedom itself. And they hadn't realized either that while immigrants who thirsted for freedom were the best assets a free country could have, immigrants who did not want freedom and who in fact despised freedom could be a terrible deficit and even a danger to that freedom. And the unfortunate fact was that Western Europe had taken in millions of immigrants whose religion did indeed teach them to despise freedom of speech, whose religion not only frowned on freedom of religion, but punished apostasy by death, and whose religion rejected equality of the sexes in 1,000 ways, both large and small. Freedom. This was the infinitely precious thing that Western Europe had to offer immigrants, but Western Europe's own leaders, its politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, and cultural elite were blind to that fact. Indeed, freedom was the one thing that Western European authorities refrained from extending to those individuals within Muslim communities who really wanted it. On the contrary, instead of recognizing freedom as a universal value and as a precious, hard-won legacy that it was their duty to protect and preserve for future generations, the Western European establishment encouraged the development within their borders of insular, patriarchal communities that preserved as if in amber an assortment of profoundly illiberal practices, prohibitions, and power structures, all of them enforced by the most extreme and reactionary members of those communities. How could this be? What had happened? What had happened was this. Islam, a comprehensive, all-encompassing ideology which insists on its own supremacy and which impresses upon its adherents their obligation to perform acts of jihad whereby the faith may be spread to every corner of the world, Islam had met that distinctly Western phenomenon known as multiculturalism, which, rather than seeking to spread the values of the Enlightenment to everyone, encourages its adherents to respect any non-Western culture, no matter how unfree, how undemocratic, and how unenlightened. Islam had met multiculturalism, and the world would never be the same again. I should immediately point out here that when I use the word multiculturalism, I am not speaking of melting pot diversity. Multiculturalism is the opposite of the melting pot. It rejects the melting pot. Multiculturalism doesn't mean caring whether individuals with non-Western backgrounds enjoy the liberties we do. It means exalting non-Western groups, treating the rules by which they live, however oppressive, as sacrosanct, and either refusing to notice their lack of individual freedom, or pretending that there is no such thing, or, alternatively, asserting that while freedom is fine for us as Westerners, a lack of freedom is just as good for them because, well, that's their culture. It's thanks to multiculturalism that some people in the West today reflexively dismiss even the noblest aspects of the liberal tradition, but can't bring themselves to condemn even such plainly reprehensible aspects of other cultures as female genital mutilation and forced marriage. For they've been taught that it's more important to respect differences between cultures than to be concerned about the human individuals who are the victims of those differences. And it's thanks to multiculturalism that some supposedly intelligent people in the West are virtually incapable of acknowledging the nature, scale, and in many cases even the very reality of the menace that the values of Sharia, the values of the Quran, pose to a truly diverse, tolerant, and secular liberal democracy. So it was that European authorities closed their eyes to women who had lived in their countries for decades without knowing that they had a legal right not to be beaten or bullied by their fathers, husbands, mothers, and sons. They closed their eyes to the young girls born in Europe for whom the idea of being able to choose one's own spouse was and would forever remain a romantic fantasy. And in many cases, shamefully, they even closed their eyes to honor killings the murders by parents and siblings of girls and women who, in some cases, only by doing no more than looking at a boy the wrong way,